This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com, and my guest tonight is none other than Bobby Fulton, one half of the legendary Fantastics tag team with Tommy Rogers, best known, I guess, for their run in Jim Crockett Promotions. But he spent some time all over the place, which we're going to get into today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited about being on your program, and I want to give a thing up front. The reason why I am not talking as well, for those of you that do not know, but for about a year and a half, I've battled throat cancer. So I'm cancer free at this time. It's messed my tongue up and my mouth up a little bit, but we'll get through this, Hannibal. I want everybody to know that no, I haven't drank a drop of liquor, nor have I done any drugs. So I'm going to be ready for this intense hour.
And yeah, you have to say that now because some of my guests lately have done both.
I've seen I've had people point out a couple of those programs, and some of them's been some friends and my dear friends of mine, and I've just said, "Oh no, what's happening?" So I'm kind of on here for about two or three reasons. One is to share with you about my career. Two is to try to give something good from my era on your program. So here we go.
Yeah, and you've been a promoter too, so I'm sure you've seen both sides of it as a promoter when wrestlers show up to events intoxicated, especially in the older days. That would be pretty
Yes.
common. What would have
Yes.
been an example of that from your days of as a promoter?
Well, as a matter of fact, I've had a couple of instances happen. One time in particular, God rest his soul, my dear friend Buddy Landell came to a show of mine in Southern Ohio. And when he showed up to the show, he was really, really well. I mean, he was ready to go. But he went and talked to some local folks and left the arena. And when he came back about 2 hours later, he could barely walk. My dad, because the Hills was in one dressing room and the Baby Faces was in another, my dad was pouring coffee down him, doing everything he could so that he could wrestle later the Junkyard Dog in the main event. Well, needless to say, we were barely able to usher Buddy out to the ring. Junkyard Dog wrestled him for about 3 minutes, pinned him 1, 2, 3, shrugged his shoulders and left. So it makes it tough when the guys are messed up, whether it be drugs and alcohol. And it wasn't very common, as a lot of people might think, for that to happen because, number one, it wasn't a hobby of ours, it was a living. So it was important for us to keep our jobs to feed our family. But it happened sometimes, and I'm not saying that drugs wasn't used or alcohol wasn't used, but if it was often, it was afterwards, after the events.
John Falsetta is one of the fans watching right now. He says the Fantastics were great everywhere against everyone, and he wants to know who was your favorite promoter to work for and who was your favorite tag team to work against.
Well, I appreciate the question. My favorite promoter, I would have had. I have a couple of them. One of them was Joe Blanchard in San Antonio, and that was pre-fantastic. He was a great promoter. He was an honest man. He was a good man. I'm not saying the rest of them wasn't honest, but I love Joe Blanchard. I loved also Paul Bosch in Houston, who was a great man. And as a matter of fact, I love Paul Bosch. Also, Jerry Jarrett, I liked him in Tennessee. Uh, they, you know, they Jerry Jarrett and them helped me, Superstar Bill Dundee, Jerry the King Lawler when I was first starting. That was Memphis was the first territory I was ever a babyface. I'd always been a heel prior to that, and I enjoyed working for Stu Hart in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I mean, it was a great place. It was a great place to learn, and Cowboy Bill Watts was the toughest of the promoters to work for because he pushed us to the limit, but it was good. I just seen Bill Dundee yesterday, and we talked about Cowboy Bill Watts and Grizzly Smith and how we were pushed and how the demands was upon us, but it was good because Bill Watts was able to take a group of rebels, more or less, men that were their own men, and form them into be some of the greatest wrestling on television, whether it was Mid South or it was later UWF. So that would be my answer to that question. My favorite teams I've wrestled with, of course, everybody knows it's going to be Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express. Also, the Sheepherders. I loved the feud with them, but I want everybody to keep in mind that we just didn't have great matches with the Midnight Express, but we had great matches with a lot of teams we wrestled. Whether it was the Midnight Express, both versions of with Chandri and Eaton and Cornette, and then Lane, Cornette and Eaton, and but we also had great matches with John Tatum and Jack Victory. We had great matches with Eric Embry and Frankie the Thumper Lancaster. We had great matches with Pat Rose and Tom Pritchard. Also, I was trying to think the New Zealand Militia, Victory and Rip Morgan, and just on and on and on. I was blessed to be in an era where tag team wrestling to me was supreme, and it worked out really well for me as far as being a part of a tag team.
You started wrestling at the age of 16. I started myself at 17, but what got you into wrestling at such a young age?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. But when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, I was walking in front of a television set. We only got three channels then. It was Channel 6 out of Columbus, Ohio. And I heard the pounding of something. And I stopped and I heard the hitting of flesh and a small studio audience either cheering or booing, and the commentator speaking slowly but also describing what was going on. And it sounded like the greatest symphony I'd ever heard in my entire life. It was music, magic and music to my ears, and it stopped me in my tracks at 5 or 6. And I began to tell, and you can ask my brother George, who was Jackie Fulton, everybody from about that point on, when I grow up, I'm going to be a professional wrestler. Then I discovered the magazines at the drugstore stand. And I would buy the wrestling magazines because there was no internet. And I read and learned about wrestlers, not only wrestling out of the Detroit, Michigan territory, but also the wrestlers that wrestled worldwide, whether it was Bruno Sammartino on the East Coast or Pat Patterson and them on the West Coast. And it was just a great time because there were so many territories, so many wrestlers, and it really helped me learn geography because then I should learn where they were and what city and towns and stuff like that. So I fell in love with wrestling at the age of 5 or 6. And yes, I started setting up the rings for a promoter here out of Ohio that worked for a guy called Al Haft, and who ran shows with Al, but broke in through Al. And Leon Graham, it was Hank and Roger Vest. Roger was the son, and I would set the rings up for him. And it was different, Hannibal then. They never spoke out of school. They didn't smart me up to the business. They kayfabed me totally. I wasn't allowed in the dressing room, although I was with the ring. They wouldn't allow me to be there, be in the dressing room. They didn't talk out of school to us. They took care of the business. And I feel that's really missing today so much in professional wrestling. It took away the magic. Sorry to babble on with that.
Yeah, there isn't as much dues that you had to pay, and the training's a lot easier now. If someone has the money, they'll train you and they won't necessarily test your toughness before teaching you. Like I'm sure you were tested. Could you tell us a little bit about what your
Well,
training was like?
well, there was no schools in wrestling. It was on the job training, and you wasn't welcomed in the wrestling business. To be honest with you, you were an outsider, and they didn't like it. So I had no real prior training. The only prior training I had was once we'd set the ring up, Hannibal. Maybe we had about 30 minutes to roll around in the ring and wrestle. My school, my high school, Southeastern High School in Richmondale, Ohio, didn't have a wrestling program. They had just started their football program. They had an outstanding basketball program, but no wrestling program. So I had no amateur background training as far as that goes. I learned on the job. I was stretched some, yes. And I wasn't going to quit for nothing. I told my father on the way to my first match, I said, Dad, I don't know how fixed this is or what, but I said, if it is, and I used to fight when I was a young boy, street fight. I love to fight. And I told him, I said, if it's not on the up and up, I'm not going to do it. He said, son, if it's not real, there's more reason to do it. You'll last longer in it. So I went into it not really knowing. Like I said, they never smartened us up to nothing, nothing, nothing. As a matter of fact, jumping ahead, and I won't do this, but Nick Goulas, when he met me and Eric Embry, he said, "You boys are what we call jabronis," and I elbowed Eric like that was a compliment. We didn't know the lingo and stuff. And plus, like you said about the schools and stuff today, I asked the people, the training people, where have you been? What have you done? And most of the time, the guys say, well, I wrestled around here about for the past 15 years. Well, how many matches have you had? We got a real watered down version of professional wrestling, Hannibal, and it's a real problem in the wrestling industry today.
There's a fan on here that wants to know more about what Missy Hyatt was like when you were working with John Tatum.
What was she like?
Yes.
She slapped my face off of me because she didn't know it works, I don't guess. But she'll tell you that we taught her, that I taught her a lot of stuff about the wrestling business. That's where she learned about it, was in the matches with us, whether it was with, and I forgot to mention earlier, I love the matches we had with Hot Stuff, Eddie Gilbert, and Sting. And there's probably some others, pardon me, that I failed to mention that I loved working with. But Missy Hyatt, shoot, she slapped it off. But I took it because you know what? It was part of the business. And when me and Tommy Rogers, what had happened the first time we ever seen Missy Hyatt, we were working for Bill Watts. And Ken Mantell asked us, said, can you guys come over here and work the Cotton Bowl? And we'll bring you in and fly you out so you can make your night show for Bill in Baton Rouge. And we said, well, as long as you can get us in and out, we'll come over. So we flew into Dallas. We went into the Cotton Bowl, and we never heard of Missy Hyatt before in our lives. And because we were working 8, 9 days a week, and 9 times a week over in Mid-South. And we got in the car from the airport, got dressed at the building as quickly as possible, was ushered out to the ring, and I'm telling you something, me and Tommy's mouth flew open because, man, she was hot. She was gorgeous looking, and we had never seen her before in our lives, so that was our first opportunity to see Missy Hyatt. And keep in mind, they were the heels, they didn't dress where we dressed, and we were the baby faces, so we didn't meet him, but she sure was easy on the eyes when we met her.
There's another fan on here, Cam. He would like to know how was working with the Road Warriors and were they as tough as they were portrayed?
Well, here's my story on the Road Warriors. Back years ago, Jerry Jarrett was going to take the territory from Jerry Lawler in Memphis. On one Saturday, we were going to show up, and they had asked me to join them, but I thought they were ribbing. And I told them, I said, well, you can't fight City Hall because Jerry Lawler and them had asked me to join his organization. So in Memphis, all of a sudden, Jerry Jarrett and him patched things up. They had 50 to 60 guys in the territory because Jerry Lawler had a territory planned. Lance Russell was going with him and everything. So what happened? Jerry Jarrett made a deal with Ole Anderson for us. Bill Dundee to be the butcher. For me, Terry Taylor were the fantastic ones. Adrian Street, Norman Frederick Charles, Toto Ware, and King Charles Fergie. He became the king, and we all, which ended up only being 6 weeks. But the long gist of it was, they booked us in the Omni, the fantastic ones, against the Road Warriors, and the Road Warriors was just hot and going. Well, I was told by my boss, and listen to this, Hannibal, and Joe talked to me about it later on. Here I was, 195. I was in real good shape, looked great, 5'9", 5'10", 5'9", and I walked into the Omni, and Ole Anderson says, tonight you're putting the Road Warriors over. And I said, we're not putting the Road Warriors over. We were told not to put them over. And Ole Anderson, you've heard the stories of how rough and gruff he is. He didn't cuss me. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me like he was befuddled or something. So I said, no, we're not going to put the Road Warriors over tonight because I was told by my boss, and I didn't tell him that again, not to put them over. The reason being was they were working in Ohio, Michigan, and West Virginia, and we were working in Georgia. And we were the top team for this superstar wrestling organization that was doing all the local TVs and everything. And if we would have put them over, it would have hurt us. So I said, no, it's not happening. Well, they worked the angle. Terry Taylor ended up saying he would, but my boss had told me no. So they did an angle where they posted me earlier in the evening. I got some color, which worked an angle for the team we were wrestling. They put Steve Osanowski out there with Terry Taylor. They put the Road Warriors over. So I never actually wrestled the Road Warriors in a tag team match. But Joe, later on, me and Tommy and him was driving down the road one night, and Joe said, Tommy, can you believe your partner back there one time wouldn't put us over? And because I thought he had forgot by then, but it was my boss that told me what to do, and I was going by what my boss said. And if my boss said no, then it was no, or if he said yes, it was yes. But that was my dealings with the Road Warriors. But I ended up loving the guys. They ended up learning the works later on. They were unbelievable, brutal at the beginning of their careers, but they got to learn the work, and they were phenomenal guys, that's for sure.
You did some enhancement work for WWF at the start of your career. How was that experience?
What was that now? Because you said out the WWF?
Yeah, when you were doing work for
Yes,
them in
yes,
Pennsylvania, I think.
yes. I wrestled for the WWF, and what happened was when I was 16, after I broke into business, Flying Freight Fury and Wild Bull Fury were big stars up in Ohio. Well, all of a sudden, I had went to a show and met Flying Freight Fury. Well, the first show I worked for him, I refereed. Then after that, he said, hey, would you like to wrestle on my show coming up? I said, sure. So I wrestled for him. Well, I was a heel. Well, all of a sudden, he said, hey, you want to start being my traveling opponent? So wherever Flying Freight Fury was booked on the then Outlaw shows, then Crazy Bobby Fulton was booked as well. And I was Wrestle Fred, and we had tremendous matches all over Ohio, Kentucky, um, Ohio, Kentucky, and Ohio, Kentucky, Michigan, West Virginia, places like that where we wrestled. Well, Flying Fred was going back in the WWF, three WFs, and he asked me if I wanted to go up there. And I wanted to jump at the opportunity because Hannibal, I had read about them guys in the magazines. And when I got to the dressing room, it was in Allentown and Hamburg. And we stayed in another town, I believe it was, Allentown and Hamburg, and Reading. I think we stayed in Reading at a hotel. So I got to the show that first time, and I stood there with my eyes wide open because it was like 50 of all the kings of wrestling. I'm talking about Chief Strombo, Dominic DeNucci, I'm the Bruno Sammartino, Ivan Koloff, and Freddie Curry came up and he said, "It's something, ain't it?" And I was just amazed. And I wanted to step back and digress a minute. Not only was I wrestling Flying Freddie Curry when I wrestled for Fred, but I also wrestled Wild Boy Curry, his father, his famous father, and had matches and tag team matches with them. But I love going up there to the WWF. My matches are on the network is Bob Fulton, and I wrestled Steve Travis. I wrestled Flying Free Jury. I wrestled Pat Patterson. I met Abdullah Farouk, who was the Grand Wizard, and it was a dream come true for me. Actually, I couldn't believe it. And then after that, Gorilla Monsoon would call me to come do the televisions, and then I got some of my friends to start going up there as well. So it was a great experience for me, and I loved it. I loved it so much.
There's a fan on here, Fargo, that says you talked in another shoot interview about Tommy getting into it with Bruiser Brody one night, and you
Yes,
actually had to stop him from getting his head rammed into a
that's
van. Could you elaborate on that?
yeah. I sure will. And I don't. Well, as a matter of fact, what happened back when we were wrestling in World Class, which was a nationwide television, Tommy and I and Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher. Well, we would get booked out all over the country for all these outlaw groups, which was now beginning to be independents. And every one of them had television, and they thought they were going to be the next big thing, the next big wrestling company. So we were at one in New Jersey, and every one of them, you'd get there 11 in the morning, and we never heard of that because we always got the wrestling shows an hour before. It wasn't any getting into these shows early, but we get there at 11 or 12, and then we'd be there all night doing 3 and 4 TV tapings for these promoters. And what it would be Brody and Abdullah on top. We would be right underneath them as the Fantastics, and we would wrestle a local tag team. Well, on this night, we were ready to get out of there, and Bruiser Brody was too. And we couldn't find Tommy anywhere, and we were in the van to go back to the hotel. And all of a sudden, about 35 minutes later, Tommy shows up. And Brody says to Tommy, "I want to ask you something right now. Are you in it for the women, or are you in it for the money?" And Tommy says, jokingly, "I guess I'm in it for the women." Brody was in the captain's chair of the van. Me and Wendy Richter was sitting in the back seat, so Tommy would have been in the middle, long seat. He spun around. He grabbed Tommy by the hair and started pounding his head into the window of the van. And I was sitting behind him, so I slid in my hand to keep Tommy's head from smashing the window or possibly breaking it out. And all of a sudden, Frank got done pounding his head on it. He never punched him or nothing. But he said, "Now I'm going to do something I would never normally do." Here, he broke open a beer and handed Tommy a beer. And he said, "I'm going to turn my back on you." And we drove off, and it was dead silence. I mean, it was something else. I mean, nobody said nothing after that. and I never really spoke about it much. I mentioned it a couple of times, and that's what happened there with that.
You worked for the Sheik a good amount. What was he like outside of the ring, and what was he like to work for as a promoter?
Now, who was that? Because you break up when you come back to me. When you get ready to talk, for some reason you
Okay,
break
I'll
up
wait
and
a few
say,
seconds next time. But the original
yes.
Sheik, what
Oh,
was he like to work for?
oh, I was a big fan of the original Sheik growing up here in Columbus, Ohio. I loved him. I loved him and so many of the other guys. Just an honorable mention, Oklahoma Kid, Jess Ortega, Flying Fred Marble Jury again, all the Pamper, Furper, all the guys. But what happened was, I'd went to, well, when I was 16, this happened. I wrestled for him the first time, and Les Ruffin called me to wrestle in a match at the Dayton Hair Arena. So I went over there and wrestled. That particular match was at the Dayton Hair Arena, and I wrestled Al Costello the first match. And we went. I was 17. We went 30-minute Broadway, me and Al Costello. Then they brought me back in a tag match to team up with a young guy they were starting to call Macho Man Randy Savage, and he was. And our opponents was Senator Al Costello as a babyface and Chief Bobby Bowdeagle. Well, in that match, I wrestled 20 minutes in the tag. So every time I went to tag Macho Man, he would back off and step outside the ring. So finally, after must have been a rib on me because about 20 minutes into the match, finally I go to tag him. He hits me, and I go down, and they pin me 1, 2, 3, and then they beats me up afterwards, Randy Savage, in a working way. Because I met him, I ran into him later. So that was the first time I worked for the Sheik. And and Bubba Brazil was there that night, of course. But I went to Nick Julis's territory in Nashville. Me and Eric Embry were Bob and Don Fulton. And one time Nick Julis said, "Hey boys, would you mind picking up the Sheik over at the La Fuente Hotel and taking him to the town this week?" Well, this was a great opportunity for me because I had in my car a magazine that said, "This is your life, Sheik." So I remember when we pulled up over there. I'm gonna tell you something, Hannibal. By this time, I'd met a lot of wrestlers. I've seen a lot of people and seen a lot of things, but he was the most classiest guy I'd ever met in my life. His street shoes he was wearing was patent leather. Although we might be going to a dark, dank arena, he was dressed impeccable. It was unbelievable. He rode in my 19, let's see, this was 77. So my Ford Galaxy 500 had to be 10 years older than that. But he was such a nice man, she was. Every night he would ride with us to the towns. He was so humble. He told us, he said, "Guys, I reckon I know about how to get you." This was before phones and MapQuest and this and that and everything. He said, "I could get you to every arena back door in the country." And he would tell us how to get to where we were going and this and that. Eric would drive and I would ride in the back seat. And I showed him that magazine, This Is Your Life Sheik magazine. And he went through the pictures and looked at it. And he said, "That picture right there where I'm throwing the fire, that was taken downstairs in my basement." But he was an awesome guy, and I really hadn't worked for him yet. But then when I went home after working for Nick Goulas, I worked for him quite a few times on shows in Point Pleasant and Parkersburg, West Virginia. That was at the end of his territory run, and they were still doing big business. But I get to also work at the Cobo Hall. As a matter of fact, the night I worked in Point Pleasant, Chief J. Strombo showed up in the territory, and he said, "Do you mind if I get a ride with you to Detroit in that same Ford Galaxy?" I said, "Sure, come on." So Chief J. Strombo, who I loved, and I thought he did an outstanding job wrestling as an Indian, rode all the way to Detroit from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. We got to the punch train hotel where the boys stayed. And Chief Jay was smart, very frugal, because he said, instead of me paying for gas, how about if I pay for the hotel room? Well, me being gullible and 17 years old, or 18 probably at this time, I said, sure, sure, sure. Well, what he did was just threw the proverbial mattress on the floor, and he slept on the mattress, and one of us slept on the box spring. But I wrestled at the Showboat Hall that night. It was unbelievable being there. And the Sheik was just awesome. A nice, nice man. And I have nothing bad to say. As a matter of fact, I did TV that day also that I worked at Showboat Hall. But I loved the Sheik as a wrestler, as a man, as a human being. He was super nice. And man, think about it, Hannibal. He was known worldwide before there was an internet. That's what a presence he had on the wrestling business. That I'm talking about the original Sheik now.
There's a few people that want to know your memories about Bobby Eaton, who passed away last week. We knew he had a lot of health issues, but it was still shocking to a lot of people because he was fairly young still.
Right. And his wife had just 50 days prior to that. And we'd worried about Bobby for the past few years about his health. I love Bobby Eaton. The first time I met him, wrestling for Nick Julius, he was a babyface. And as a matter of fact, when he was a babyface there, he teamed with George Julius. They were called the Jet Set. And he and George wrestled Eric Embry and I. We were the Fulton brothers, Bob and Don Fulton, and we had a lot of matches with them. And Bobby was just a natural. And I remember when Bobby turned heel in Nashville, there for Nick Golis, the Sheik was there then. And the Sheik told him, said, Bobby, why don't you do what Ben Justice did up in Michigan and Ohio? When he turned heel finally, every time the announcer would ask him something, just start laughing. Just start laughing. And the Sheik was helping him, and I remember that about that. Bobby Eaton was a natural when it came to wrestling. I wrestled him, if not hundreds, thousands of times. Bobby was phenomenal in the ring, but as much as he was phenomenal in the ring, he was a great person on the outside. I just spent yesterday with Bill Dundee, Friday with Bill Dundee all day. I drove all the way back from Memphis yesterday. I drove all the way, and I told Bill, I said, Bill, I never heard Bobby shout, get mad, or anything like that. He was nothing but kind to everybody. And he was a loving, lovable guy. And he was a giving and a caring guy. I'll never forget, I was never good at drop kicks. I happened to team with guys that had the best drop kicks in the business, one being Tommy Rogers of the Fantastics, and later on of the new Fantastics, my brother George Hines, Jackie Fulton, who had one of the best drop kicks in the business. But I didn't have a real good drop kick. And I remember Bobby trying to teach me when I worked for Jarrett. He'd say, bail me, Bobby, across the ring. Take off running and drop kick him. And I'd drop kick him so hard, Hannibal, I'd about knock him through the ropes. I mean, he couldn't really take a professional looking bump, but he helped me in the ring. He gave me boots. There's a pair of trunks that I just signed a picture for. It says BF on them, and they're red and blue. But those really said BE, and I cut the little line off of the E and made him say BF. He gave me trunks. I love Bobby Eaton. It broke my heart when he died. I can't begin to tell you how much it bothered me because it was unexpected. And we lost so many unexpectedly, especially recently, to go and pass away. So, but Bobby Eaton, of course, he'll live forever in our minds and our hearts. And one of the great good guys of the wrestling business, Hannibal, Bobby Eaton.
Now, of course, you also worked in Puerto Rico. How was your experience working for Carlos Colon up there? A lot of people had pay issues over the years. but you were there during its peak years, so hopefully you didn't
Right,
have those
right,
issues.
right, right, right. Well, I had a few experiences over in Puerto Rico. I had the experiences when we wrestled in the peak years. They just bring us in, Tommy and I, for the weekends. I never worked it full time. They would fly us in and fly us out, and they paid us very handsomely for coming over. We worked the big stadium shows and the shows like that. We'd come in, I think, Hannibal on Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays and worked. And we would come in from, I can't remember what territory we were wrestling for then, but they would let us go and go there and this and that. And we always got paid good money. We had great matches with whoever we wrestled. And then as that went on, this and that, and had great matches in Puerto Rico, and we got paid fairly and squarely. Was treated really nice. And then Bruiser Brody got killed over there. And then Tommy Rogers told me, he said, Bobby, I'm not going back ever to Puerto Rico. And Tommy was starting to slow his schedule down a lot then anyway. He got a job with Coca-Cola in Florida, was trying to put his first marriage back together. And that's when I was kind of bringing my brother along with me some. So I told him, I said, Tommy, if you're not going to go, I knew Bruiser Brody enough to know that if I was killed in Puerto Rico, Bruiser Brody would still work there. And I believe that, Hannibal. And I knew Bruiser Brody really well, going back to an incident in San Antonio where I found out by reading a book by Larry Matizak that he quit Joe Blanchard because Frank was mad because I made the same amount of money he made on a show. So I told Tommy, I'm going back to Puerto Rico. And we started going with Dick Murdoch was booking. But the eerie thing of it was, when I first went back to Puerto Rico, after Frank had been killed, and I love I love Bruiser Brody. I loved him. And when we landed in Puerto Rico, me and my brother, the strangest thing was when we got to the hotel phone rang. And I answered the phone, and all of a sudden it was this phone call. Amigo. I said, yes. He said, this is Jose Gonzalez. And I started shaking, and the phone was shaking, Hannibal. How was your trip, my friend? Because I knew Jose, and I'd never had a problem with him. Never, never. But here he was, this guy who'd killed my friend Bruiser Brody. Calling me on the phone. I said, Jose, our trip was fine. Thank you so much. So I got off the phone with him. I told my brother, I said, that was real disturbing, but nevertheless, we're here and we're going to work. So we were wrestling and flying in and out of Puerto Rico on the weekends again. So finally it came to one weekend and it was bad business. Business was bad. Carlos said, ride with me to the town today. And I said, Carlos, your business is bad. The 1-2 things that you have here is you and Jose that's never really wrestled each other. And as we went to the town, I laid out a program for him and Jose to do. So I said, the people believe in you and they believe in Jose. And I said, if you guys work this angle, you'll draw money again, including Ronnie Garvin, who was coming in at that point, because I'd got Ivan Koloff coming in as well prior to that. And he said, all right. Well, the bad thing of it was, the last night, the Sunday night, they were supposed to pick us up. They didn't pick us up at the hotel. The Hills had told us to get in the car, and I said, no, I'm not riding with the Hills. Somebody will pick us up. No one picked us up. We never got paid for that weekend, and what was strange was, on the way to the town, and you could ask my brother George, Jackie Fulton, Carlos said, if I do this annual, Bobby, I'm bringing you in for a big payoff. I said, fine. But we didn't get paid for that weekend. Months later, I asked Ronnie Garvin how was business in Puerto Rico. He said, it's doing great. I said, what happened? He said, they shot this angle. Boom, boom, boom. I thought, yeah, that's the one I gave them. But nevertheless, I never got paid for the very last 3 days I was down there. And so it was that I got screwed out of that. I got screwed out of the big payday and I was using that angle because I'd seen Jerry Lawler and Dutch Mantell do it in Memphis, and both of them stayed babyface, and they drew big money all over the territory, and I knew they could work down there with them. So that was my Puerto Rico experience.
A fan on here, Rick Brooks, has a bit of an unusual question for you. He wants to know if you have any memories of the Hells Angels, Chris Colt and Ron
Oh
Dupree.
yes, yes. I grew up with a big tag team. As a matter of fact, California Hells Angels. I remember talking to a neighborhood girl when I was 6 or 7, 8 years old, talking about because the Hells Angels. I mean, I know they're a big biker group now, but it seemed like they were more prevalent because back then the movies was out, the Hells Angels and bikers, and people was afraid of them. And we didn't see them all the time because we didn't have cable television, and number two, we didn't have the internet. So the California Hells Angels, I loved watching them wrestle in the ring. Ronnie Dupree and Christopher Schultz. I never got a chance to meet neither one of them. I would have loved to. And Trish Schultz, as a matter of fact, I met a lot of people that wrestled him. In Hannibal, they told me that he was, and I should see he was a great wrestler. But they said when he was straight, not smoking dope, or on drugs or drinking, he could barely work. But you send him out the ring, high as a Georgia pine, he could have what some people would quote as 5 and 6 star matches, and he was just phenomenal as far as taking bumps and stuff like that. Trish Throat was great. Was great.
And in his later years, he became a gay porn star, apparently.
Yes, and he was also a German apparently for a while wrestling, Chris Von Colt, and he went out to Portland and wrestled, and this and that. So, but he was phenomenal in the ring, and even back then we knew he was gay. I mean, I was a kid, but when I broke into business, and you know what, Hannibal, when we knew who was gay and who wasn't, we didn't talk about that stuff. It was nobody's business, and for this and that, and we knew who the gay people was in the business and who the gay people wasn't, and but he was known as one of them. And like you said, as a matter of fact, I'd read that his name Chris Schultz came from a gay magazine, something like that. I'm not for sure, but I also know that in Street, who I had a program with in San Antonio years before the Fantastics, and they were a tag team over in England, which I think Chris Schultz got kicked out of England for something or another that he had done. So, but I mean, the guy had a reputation outside the ring, but he had a phenomenal reputation inside the ring.
Now, you were part of the Fantastics. Obviously, the girls loved you guys, and you also
Yes.
worked in a lot of the territories that were known for having groupies. Could
Yes.
you, which would have been the best territory for the groupies, and is there any stories you could share with us?
Well, I'm gonna tell you honestly, they were all of them was great, except for one. And me and Bill Dundee just talked about this the other day. I'll tell you what happened. Bill Dundee looked at a picture of me and Tommy Rogers was sitting on his desk, on his table, and he looked down at that picture on Friday, and he said, "Bobby Fulton, that's why the territories you guys was in was popping." He said, "Bill Watts wanted Dick Murdoch and somebody else on top." He said, "How many girls are going to go watch Dick Murdoch and some of these big guys wrestle?" Said, "But it was you guys like you, the Rock and Roll Express, other teams that drew the women in. And where the women are, Hannibal, the men are. I'm talking about the general public, because they say, hey, where's all the beautiful girls hanging out at? Was right there at the wrestling matches. It didn't matter what territory it was in. My brother George Jackie, you know why he broke into business, Hannibal? He broke into business because he came to Houston, Texas, while he was in college. And there was 1,000,000 beautiful women there. And he said, my, I've got to get in the wrestling business. He had never wanted nothing to do with the wrestling business up until that point until he seen the fringe benefit. So every territory was great as far as the women, except for one territory that I went to, and I about starved to death there because Bill Dundee was right. Where there's no girls at the matches, there's no men, boys coming to look at them, and that was Kansas City territory. There was no girls, not hardly many women came to the wrestling match. And so me and Bill talked about that too on Friday. But it's true. So
Yeah,
it
I
was
always
out.
heard that was not a fun territory to work because the pay was really bad.
Right,
And
right,
now
right.
that we find out that too, I guess it really wasn't fun.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what. One time I was driving, and we was going to the peachy. The snow was real deep, and I was telling Bill and them this Friday. And what happened? I had to pee, so I got out before we played the toll. So I was peeing in the snow, and I looked down. There was a $20 bill, and because how I was able to survive in the territory, I had a Mercury Marquis, a Grand Mercury Marquis, and I took three of the other boys with me, and they paid trans. Well, as I was peeing, I looked down. There was a $20 bill, and I showed the boys in the car. I said, "Look, I just found a 20." They said, "No, you didn't." Then all of a sudden, I looked down, there was another 20. I picked it up. I said, "Look." And about that time, everybody jumped out. I found about four or five $20 bills out there in the snow by the grace of God. And they dove out of the car. They were, they were digging through the snow. They were looking for it because, yes, the money was tight in Kansas City. But Dewey Robertson, the missing link, told me, he said, "Bobby, I stayed there in Kansas City, not making a dime, so I could just learn the wrestling business." And then after Dewey learned all the wrestling skills, he became the missing link where he didn't use one of them. I didn't understand that.
The brother man wants to know what you think about WWE and AEW today, and if you think wrestling territories could ever make a comeback.
Well, the wrestling today, it lacks passion. It lacks passion. Being it lacks passion from the audience. Number one, and it lacks. They do all kinds of great moves and better athletes than we ever thought we would be. But all those moves mean nothing if there's no substance in the matches, and that's what it's missing. And it's in the last substance in wrestling was probably the Rock and Stone Cold and them in that era. And it's not to blame the boys, but it's what they're wanting. And listen, I should make people cry by selling in the ring, and I have, and I still do it when I did it on the independent shows in the last years up until I got throat cancer. I can make people cry, and I make them want to crawl in the ring and help me. And as a heel, I make them want to fight me. But they don't do that anymore. Number one, they took away the ideal of a babyface and a heel. In every John Wayne movie, you know who the good guy was and the bad guy. And that's one thing in wrestling. When you take away that element, that hurts the business right off. Nobody's a shade of gray. Everybody's a good guy and a bad guy. Number two, they don't. You got to grab a hold. How many UFC guys do you see doing moonsaults off the top? But what's their buy rate on the pay per view? And I know they punch and kick on UFC, but they also grab holds and worship. And I say worship because I've met a couple of those guys, and I also promoted MMA. I promoted Tough Man too for years, Hannibal, 10 years, and I had an Octagon, and I promoted MMA fights, met some of the fighters. And while I don't think all of it's a work, I believe some of it's a work. And I'm not insulting nobody, but I'm just telling you, the UFC hijacked the wrestling business, MMA did. So there you go. I think it lacks as far as passion to get the people to really care about somebody. It's not there anymore, and it needs to be there. The aim needs to be. They need interviews, and another thing they need to do: go back to helping these local towns and cities raise money. It was one of the pluses in every territory we wrestled in that we would go to high school. We'd be in a major coliseum one night, be in a high school the next, raising money for the local uh, uh, band boosters or whatever that would be. And I think that needs to be back in wrestling. I think that wrestling should be, if it should happen, I think it should if it's done right, but never has the money or the brains been met. Once that's done, then you can have some good old fashioned professional wrestling at its best.
The promos overall are better in MMA these days too, I find.
The what now?
The promos, like the wrestler or the fighters on the mic in
Yes,
MMA are a lot better than most of the wrestlers these days.
it's believable, and that's what's lacking in wrestling. Listen, when I go to a magic show, I don't want to see them tell me how he done the tricks. When I take my kids to see Santa Claus, if I would have, I don't want to see a guy sitting up there in a pair of blue jeans, skinny, not with a beard and a red suit. So why must we insist to continue to convince the people that wrestling is fake and a work, and that now they're taking bumps on the edge of the ring, on the aprons of the ring where it makes no noise, where it just cripples them. Man, Bill Dundee looked at me the other day at 60. He said, Bobby, I told you quit taking all them bumps. He said, look at you. But look, I get slowly around to 60, plus I fought through the cancer and everything. But some of these guys, if they live to be 60, aren't going to be walking. And I hate it for them. But also at the same time, I went down and guest coached at the WWE Performance Center. And I loved it down there. And they're training them all the right way and this and that. So I don't know what they're trying to do with wrestling today. They're trying to reinvent the wheel, and this building D told me too. It doesn't need reinvented. Just go with what was there and use it. I just don't understand why they don't.
Now, you actually had a match on Raw in, I think, June of '97 against your partner.
Right.
How did that whole situation happen? And was there originally going to be more to it, or what was the whole deal there?
No, I was running my tough business then. I was making lots of money, more money than I could ever make in the wrestling business. And I was not taking any bumps. I love the wrestling business, mind you, but it was a source of revenue. And I wasn't interested in wrestling, and I would only wrestle every once in a while for the fun of it. But Jim Cornette told me, he said, Bobby, I'm trying to talk Vince McMahon into using smaller guys. He just he won't do it. He won't do it. And he said, would you please come up here and 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 wrestle? And he said, would you come up here with Tommy Rogers? I said, well, Jimmy, I'm going to tell you this. I'm not coming up here to wrestle full time. And I'm not coming up there to team with Tommy Rogers. But I'll wrestle Tommy. And we'll do it once. And Vince can look. And if it's something that he likes to do, then your door will be open to bring in smaller guys. So we went up there and we wrestled that night. I knew it was a one and done deal because I wasn't interested. I had short, dark hair, just like I got now. And I wasn't interested in wrestling full time again because, listen, Hannibal, I didn't want to go to work. And this is the bad thing about the wrestling business back then. You move your family, you do this and do that, and maybe it's that way today. And after about 6 months, you're not the twinkle in their eye, and then they say you're fired. Well, I had security in my business that I'd built, and I also had a John Laurinaitis, he told me about going and helping in OVW and different places just as a scout, and I told him no. No, and that was the reason why I didn't want to do that full time anymore. So that's what happened with the Raw deal.
How was your
Why I wanted it
experience?
done.
How was your experience working with the Von Erichs?
I love the Von Erichs. Hannibal, you couldn't have met a nicer bunch of young men. I mean, I loved them all, and I was there after. I met David one time in St. Louis when I worked the Kansas City territory. But as far as Kevin and Mike and Sherry and even little Chris, it was the nicest guys, just like they knew us their whole lives, talked to us really good, and really great. They were characters. They were like great big kids, grown kids. As a matter of fact, one day I was in San Antonio, and Chris Von Erich said, "Bobby, I'm going to carry your bags for you." I said, "All right, Chris, you can carry them." He goes, "Bobby, one day you're going to be carrying my bags." I bust out laughing and everything, but I was there when Mike killed himself, and what was ironic about that was Hannibal was just a couple of days before we were in a high school gym doing one of those fundraisers, and there was a roll of tape there on the floor from the high school, and Mike Von Erich said, "Oh, I ain't gonna take that tape. I ain't gonna use it because to me that'd be stealing. I don't want to do nothing wrong." And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 days later, he's missing. And then we find out he zipped himself up in a sleeping bag and took a bunch of pills and ended his sickness, which I was there when he had the sickness, the I can't remember what the name of it was, but toxic shock syndrome. And he was frail and he tried to come back to wrestling. I don't think Mike ever wanted to be a wrestler. And I was there and I teamed with the Von Erichs and I always loved it. I was in 6-man tags with them and this and that. And Kevin said, we always liked asking Bobby Fulton to come and be a part of our 6-man tag matches whenever they needed me and everything. So it was a great experience. And Hannibal, I'm going to tell you something. We were the WWE in world class, going worldwide before the WWE, because we went to Israel and wrestled. We went to Lynn, Massachusetts, and sold it out. I remember going to Chicago to the airport when I was in WCW, and people knew me, and I'm not just saying it, at the airport before they knew the rest of the boys that was at WCW. Why? Because of world class wrestling. And they told me that. World class was strong and it was powerful and it was worldwide. We even had people from Japan come over and do videos for the local TV stations in Japan before we even went to Japan because of world class wrestling television. So it was powerful, very powerful. But as far as the Von Erich boys, I love the Von Erich boys, and tragedy what happened to the family.
Just a couple more fan questions I'll ask here to wind it
Yes,
down. Pat
yes,
wants
sir.
to know, of all the titles that you held, which title had the most value to you?
The titles, the titles. Well, I had my first championship that I held after wrestling full time was the USA Junior Heavyweight title in San Antonio. And that means a lot to me because that was the first place that I got a break, a push. Hannibal, when I walked in the San Antonio office, I had been training, I'd been working in Memphis. I walked in the office and Joe Blanchard, I met a lady by the name of Renee Johnson, who was the secretary. But Joe Blanchard had come out of a little makeshift gym there at the office, sweating like a dog. He was crippled up from a car wreck he'd been in. He told me that night, told me that day, he said, listen, son, when the promoter meets a wrestler, he either sees little money, big money, or no money. Now, I didn't understand what he meant by saying that, but that night I wrestled the first match of the show, and he paid every night. That first match he paid me, the first match of the show, he paid me $400 cash in 1983. That's like $1,200, $1,300, $1,500 in today's money. Should you imagine that? But I love that title because me and Eric Embry had, and me and Adrian Street had my first angels and stuff that I worked with, and this and that. I love that title. But all the tag team titles we held, Tommy and I held, whether it was World Class, Mid South, UWF, Tennessee titles, the belts, which we stole them from Jerry Jarrett because he had our money, and we took them titles. And I ended up trading them to a guy who ended up making belts, Jamar, who ended up making belts for UFC because I gave him them belts and he learned how to make those Reggie Park belts from the plates that I had on those. So those belts meant a lot. The NWA United States title, who don't like the NWA? If you're a wrestling fan, been alive as long as I did, at one time I was part of the NWA wrestlers and we ruled the world. The WWF was just a regional territory, and so was the AWA. But the NWA National Wrestling Alliance was worldwide back then, so those belts meant a lot to me.
And last question I'll ask for today, I think we'll have to have you back again sometime, is
Thank
from
you,
Rick
sir.
Brooks. He wants to know if you have any Wild Bill Curry stories.
Wild Bill Curry
I know you were
stories.
close with him.
Wild Bill Curry stories. Wild Bill Curry stories. Wild Bill Curry told me riding down the road one day, he said, Ernie the Big Cat Lad is just like a son to me, and I'm like a father to him. And later I get to wrestle Ernie the Big Cat Lad. And as a matter of fact, Paul Bosch gave me a book that Paul Bosch had written. And he said this in the book, he wrote it to me. He said, Bobby Fulton, whenever you write down the list of men that's most proudest of you and your accomplishments in wrestling, he said, would you put my name right down under Wild Bill Curry? And that meant so much to me because Fred Curry and Wild Bill Curry, well, Fred Curry especially was a mentor, but here was Wild Bill Curry, one of the meanest, toughest guys. But one night on a Thanksgiving night, I told you I was always a heel in my early career. I was wrestling a tag team match against Wild Bill and Flying Fred. And what the deal was, Flying Fred would get the heat on him, and then Bull would be standing over there mean looking, waiting for the hot tag, and he'd come in, he's in the house. I was Thanksgiving night. It was sold out show. Well, they made that comeback. Wild Bill Curry did. He knocked me out of the ring. He came out, hit me with a chair, and Hannibal, if I'm lying, I'm flying, and I don't have any wings on. Everybody in the building picked up their chairs and started throwing them at me. So here I am laying there selling. Fred Curry and Bull Curry's in the ring. The whole building's going nuts. They had that much magnetism to them. It was just magical how they were. I loved Wild Bill Curry. I shouldn't believe him. I remember one time in the dressing room, he told me, he said, I'm the same age as Lou Thesz. He said, and I've got one picture of him in the dressing room. Back then, you wasn't allowed to be a marshal in the dressing room, but I'd had a little Instamatic camera, not Polaroid, but I had to get it developed. And he took a picture, which I still have the picture, but you could tell he kind of didn't like it that I taken one. One of the boys taking a picture of him, but I can't remember what I was getting ready to say there about him, but what I was getting ready to say was that he was a great guy, Wild Bill Curry. He was so believable. People believed in him. And that's what's missing in the business too. Guys that look like him, everybody looks the same. But take a guy like Wild Bill Curry, stick him out there, and he'll get noticed.
Is there anything you'd like to plug before we wrap it up here? I know you still are doing lots of stuff online and you're doing appearances here and there as well.
Yes, yes, sir. I was in Charlotte a couple of weeks back. Tommy Rogers and I was honored at the gathering, which I think me and you talked a little bit about. That's an event you might want to come to next year. There's a lot of the boys there, and it was a tremendous turnout. As a matter of fact, Bobby Eaton was supposed to have been there, but of course he was sick still, and then showed up. My son and I have a business, Big Time Collectibles, that we do virtual sales and this and that and everything. But you know, I'll probably never wrestle again. I say that I'm getting shoulder surgery. I was supposed to have shoulder surgery before I found out I had throat cancer. Shows I can't move my right arm very much at all. But I'm getting that this Christmas, and never say never, right? I love the wrestling business. when I didn't wrestle no more, I could still go out there with guys. If I was wrestling Chase Stevens or somebody knew what they was doing, I could go out there and still get the job done. But I still want to go out and make personal appearances, like you said. I love the fans. I love the business. I love seeing all the boys, and I just love still being a part of it. What it can be, the professional wrestling business.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed.